Well, I'll tell you what, let me start off, Ed. First, I'll thank you for having me. This is a privilege, whether it's myself or someone else at the company. We do like to go around and talk to the different survivor groups across the nation and basically spread awareness about prostate cancer, the disease itself, but also the research that's being done, whether it's not it's in our lab or in different labs across the country. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about prostate cancer screening and research in 2025, highlighting some of the realities that are going on in Canada and where we are today. I'm going to focus primarily on early diagnosis and the impact of screening for early diagnosis. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll interrupt for just a second. We have people who are online on Zoom, and if any of you have a question, we don't want to leave you out. If you put it in the chat box, Doug will try to watch the chat box and see if something comes up. So
perfect.
You're included. Okay.
Okay. So to make sure that are my slides changing? There we go. So just to introduce myself. I was born and raised in a very small fishing village in Newfoundland on the southwest coast. If you find yourself there, it's not by accident. It's a little place called Burgeo, Newfoundland. If any of you have read Farley Mowat and A Well for the Killing, that's my hometown. So I got my undergraduate and first graduate degree at Memorial University in St. John's. From there, I went on to the University of Alberta and did an advanced degree in metabolism, and then went on from there to do an immunology postdoctoral fellowship at Dalhousie University. Following that, I moved to a contract research organization, so it's a scientific company called InnovaScreen, where essentially we screened new compounds, new therapies for different companies across the world to see if they could make it to the next level of development. From there, I moved to the University of Western Ontario as a visiting research scientist, and we had also obtained some intellectual property for a drug delivery system, and that became basically the basis of a company called Entos. During the COVID outbreak in 2020, this company stepped up and was one of the Canadian companies that were able to build new vaccines and really push the ability of Canada to hold its own in developing and manufacturing vaccines. At the same time, I moved later back to the University of Alberta with my boss, Dr. John Lewis, who I've worked with since about 2007. And from there, we really got into and started pushing our work into prostate cancer research. And I'll talk a little bit about more of that in the next slide. We developed a research initiative called the Alberta Prostate Cancer Research Initiative, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And today I am a co-founder and chief scientific officer at Nanostics. We manage so my role basically is to manage the research and development, the pure scientists. So if you listen to CBC, the white coat, dark arts. But we also have a clinical arm where we offer different types of tests to men across the country. So really, I want to attribute everything that we've been able to accomplish because a prostate cancer patient, Frank Sajunki, asked a question. He advocated for his own health, and he advocated for research that would impact patients. Back in around 2005, 2007, sometimes about there, Frank moved from British Columbia to Edmonton, Alberta, and was visiting his urologist. And basically, he was told by his urologist that he had to go to Toronto and get a test. And Frank, being Frank, basically said, why the hell do I have to go to Toronto when I'm living in the wealthiest province in Canada? Why can't I just get the test there? And the urologist replied, well, we don't have the equipment. We don't have the machine. So Frank said, well, how much is it? It's about $250,000. Now, Frank was a very successful businessman, and he had a pretty big network. So he said, well, go buy it, and I'm going to go talk to some buddies, and I'll find the money. So about a week later, he came back. He had talked to a bunch of friends and told them the issue, and he had raised the money. From there, he went back to his urologist and he said, okay, so I found this money. It wasn't too hard to do. But if you didn't have this equipment, what kind of research is going on at the University of Alberta to help prostate cancer, push prostate cancer research? And the urologist said, well, there's a little bit being done here, there's a little bit being done in Calgary, but nothing substantial. And that kind of irritated Frank, and he said, well, what do we have to do to change that? And the urologist said, well, what we would need is to actually make a chair for prostate cancer research. So Frank's next question was, how much would that cost? About $5 million. So over the next few years, Frank and his buddies called themselves the Bird Dogs. Because they basically, if they found somebody that had a checkbook with some money, and they got them in a room, they were like a dog on a bird. Once they had the scent and the sight, they weren't going to let you go until you deposited some money into this in this foundation. They were able to raise, in conjunction with the Alberta Cancer Foundation, not only the $5 million for the research chair, but an additional number of millions that went towards Da Vinci robots and different infrastructure at the K Edmonton Clinic right now. And that's where my boss came into play. In December of 2011, my boss, Dr. John Lewis, came to me and he said, would you be interested in going back to Alberta? And I essentially said it would have to be for the right reason. We were in Ontario, and at that point I was looking at homes there. My wife is from Toronto. And he basically laid out the opportunity that was being afforded to us in Alberta. And we had a number of research directions that we knew what we had to do. And Frank's $5 million sort of input into a research chair gave us the ability to build on those ideas. And that's when we decided to move. So late in 2011, I was invited to come here with my boss, and January 2nd, we landed in Alberta. Now, since that time, we've been able to build a translational network to improve patient outcome. We've built 6 different research platforms that include all the different omics, whether it's metabolomics or proteomics, genes, drug delivery. We have clinical teams both in Edmonton and Calgary, which is interesting. If you think the rivalry between Toronto and Montreal or Toronto and Ottawa is big, you should come to Alberta and try to throw a puck between Edmonton and Calgary. We also have an ability to screen drugs with a very unique platform. We also have a team of nearly 40 fundamental scientists and clinical scientists, so physicians that are also interested in doing fundamental research. We've trained nearly 100, if not more, master's students, PhD students, and postdocs. We have over 100 clinical and admin staff to make all of this happen. And since then, since that time back in I think about 2013, when we started the Alberta Prostate Cancer Research Initiative, which is this translational network, we've been able to enroll over 11,000 men here in the province. We've collected over 120,000 aliquots of blood, urine, and semen to actually go towards new diagnostic tests. And we've sent out over 20,000 of these samples across the world, because we basically said, we don't know if we're going to come up with a new idea. But if we have this really good set of samples and the data that goes with it, perhaps somebody else will beat us to it, and that's fine. But we've had 3 translational successes. 3 companies have been spun out or matured. Oncocynics, which is working on treatments for prostate cancer. Entos, which is a drug delivery company. And Nanostics, which is a diagnostic company. And I'll talk more about that later. So just to sort of put into clarity, one of the very first talks that I gave in Alberta was to the Korean Veterans Association. And after my talk, and it was basically what we wanted to do as a academic research team. And as you might, it was pie in the sky kind of idea, big and bold. But after my talk, and I talked about prostate cancer and the disease itself, a gentleman came up and put his arms around me. He's a giant of a man. He cried on my shoulder because I had talked about some of the issues of getting a biopsy, which included incontinence. And no one had ever told him that that was a result of his biopsy or a potential result of his biopsy. So after that, that changed the way that I did research, and it changed the way that research was conducted in our lab. There was a new impetus, a new responsibility that we all felt. And from there, the mission of the company that we have right now is basically to enable better diagnosis by providing you, the patient, and the physician more clarity about the decisions that you have to make. We want to give you as much information as possible so that you can make the best informed decision. So before we get into what we've been able to develop, let's talk a little bit more about understanding prostate cancer screening as it is today in Canada. So last year, there were nearly 28,000 new diagnoses of prostate cancer across Canada. Nearly 5,000 men died of prostate cancer. That's too many. The number of diagnoses is hard to change, but we can impact the number of men. We can reduce the number of men that are dying of prostate cancer. How do we do that? The key is finding that cancer early enough. And I just want to make sure that you can see my cursor moving.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So if you go in and you get a prostate biopsy, if we can tell that the cancer is within the prostate down here, or it's in the region around the prostate, men have more than a 99% chance of survival. If unfortunately we diagnose that prostate cancer to be outside of that regional area around the prostate, you have only a 32% chance of survival. It doesn't matter if, whatever race you are, it doesn't matter anything. Those are the general stats. Early diagnosis improves outcomes by more than threefold. So get checked, find it early enough, and you have better chances of survival. So let's talk about that. How do we screen? How do we find this prostate cancer early enough? And you've all heard of PSA screening. On this graph here, basically what I'm showing you is the number of men that die according to prostate cancer. In the mid to late 60s, up to about 75, men were dying and we thought it was due to prostate cancer, but we weren't sure. Then the PSA test came along, and all of a sudden we had a way to link a cancer in the prostate to prostate cancer. And you can see that over the next 10, 15 years, the number of men dying based on prostate cancer went up. It's not that there were more men dying of prostate, we were just better able to identify those men. In 1986, the first PSA test was introduced in Canada, and we started to use that test to identify men at risk. In the mid-90s, PSA screening really started to take hold. Now, basically what you see from the mid-90s going on down to about 2005, you actually start to see more than a 3% decrease in the number of men dying of prostate cancer each year. We were screening more and more men for prostate cancer using PSA, and we were actually finding them at earlier stages of the disease, and we were able to treat them. Now, that's a bit of a double-edged sword. But let's put it in context. No matter what cancer you're screening for, the absolute survival benefits are not really obvious. There are times when we measure the benefit of screening in days to months. But when you rank PSA screening against all these other tests, whether it's a mammogram or the blood in the urine or colonoscopy or a lung CT, PSA screening is as good or better than nearly every other screening test. That's a reality. It's often vilified in the media, though. So that begs the question, if prostate cancer screening with PSA reduces the number of men dying of prostate cancer, why don't we use it more? PSA screening in Ontario and British Columbia is not covered by the government. It doesn't make sense. The data are there. It tells us that PSA screening works, but why? Well, as you know, screening is the first pass. Some men show up with blood in the urine. Other men show up with really bad backs. Some men get the PSA blood test and show an elevated PSA. Other men get a digital rectal exam. But all of this together, there's still 85% of false positives. And that's screening. Oop. Sorry, my computer froze there for a second. The only way to diagnose prostate cancer, as you all well know, is with a biopsy. Now, depending on where you are, that typically requires 12 needles through the wall of your colon into the prostate. And I don't need to tell this audience, it's invasive, it's uncomfortable, and there are risks associated with it, including incontinence, impotence, and infection. The numbers actually tell us about 80% of men that have a prostate biopsy didn't need it. If your prostate cancer stays in your prostate, you have a greater chance of dying of getting hit by a car or something else. That's the reality. But of course there were concerns. Because PSA screening became so prevalent, more and more men were getting a biopsy, which meant even just statistically, more men were having comorbidities. They were having there were increased rates of infection or impotence or incontinence. And that's because PSA is not specific to cancer. An elevated PSA means fundamentally that your PSA is increased. It doesn't indicate why, and that's the issue. An elevated PSA is not specific to cancer. You might have a large prostate, which means you're going to have a larger concentration of PSA. You may have an infection, which means that your PSA in your blood is going to go up. You may have been riding a bike or for whatever reason working really hard, and your prostate is a walnut-sized gland that sits in the middle of your girdle. And if you compress it, you're going to get some PSA leaking out into your blood. So an elevated PSA is an elevated PSA. The question becomes, why is it elevated? But that meant that there was a high burden of investigation. We were doing many more biopsies, and there was much more overtreatment for men that had clinically indolent disease, which means it's not aggressive. And that's what we have to do. Now, because of all this, the different task force in the US and in Canada basically came out and said, don't use PSA as a screening tool for prostate cancer. Now, these typically are revised every few years. The US was revised in 2018 and is currently under revision. In Canada, the task force came out and said in 2014, do not screen for prostate cancer using PSA at any age. This is what's taught in medical schools. This is what is referred to your family physicians across the country. Now, there was an update planned in 2026, but as of, I think the first week in March, this task force was actually paused. There were 5 or 6 other indications that immediately stopped. So right now, I can't tell you if there's going to be an update in this prostate cancer screening recommendation. Sorry, my computer is going very slow. I don't know if it's the connection. But what does this mean? So in 2014, we kind of stopped doing this. So this sort of recommendation came out about, the mid 2000s going into 2014, 2012. It was starting to be talked about more and more. But what did this translate to? What did this mean in the clinic? Well, remember I said that if we can find the prostate cancer early enough, it's going to be found in the prostate or in that area around the prostate, so the regional area. And in this graph, what you see is after those recommendations were made, the number of men showing up with prostate cancer in the prostate started to go down. At the same time, men with much more advanced disease were showing up, which meant this reduced screening led to sort of a reverse stage migration, meaning we were seeing more men with more aggressive cancer at the time of diagnosis, which is the opposite of what we want to be seeing, which means your treatment options are decreased and your chances of survival are decreased. So that all goes to the family physicians, which is what, those are the docs that most of us see. What about the specialists? What about the urologists? What did they say? Well, even at the time of these recommendations coming out in the early 2010s, the urologists disagreed. In 2022, the Canadian Urological Association recommended that PSA screening should not be avoided. More importantly, the use of adjunctive tests or secondary tests to provide the benefits of screening, but yet avoid the unnecessary harms associated with these biopsies. So in detail, they actually suggest start PSA testing at age 50 in most men or earlier if there's an increased risk of prostate cancer. And basically, we all want to know the numbers. So essentially, men with a PSA at greater than 3 nanograms per mil or 3 micrograms per liter, they should require or should consider more frequent PSA testing intervals or adjunctive testing strategies. What does that mean? What are the goals that we're trying to do? We're trying to figure out what's the ideal screening approach. Well, we want to preserve the benefits of prostate cancer screening in reducing the number of men dying of prostate cancer. We want to catch more men early enough when they have more treatment options available to them. At the same time, we want to reduce overdiagnosis and overtreatment so that we don't expose those men that don't need to go for a biopsy, that they don't go to these invasive diagnostic procedures. But at the same time, we want to identify those men that need treatment so we can say, you come to the front of the line, get the necessary biopsy, get the necessary treatments that you need sooner than later. And that's where we came in. So Dr. Lewis and myself came here and we built a significant team. Over the first 5 years of being here, we were able, luckily enough, all the different tools came together. The samples came together, the clinical data came together, and we had the right people on the ground in Edmonton and Calgary that we had what we thought was good enough for a test. At that point, the different stakeholders said to us, so we're going to come back and revisit Frank's mandate. Will you now tell us that you have a test? So we're going to stop funding you until you give us a business plan and start a company. And that's when Nanostics was formed. In 2017, we incorporated a company with 4 of us. There were 4 founders that came out of the John Lewis lab. Myself, Dr. Lewis as the CEO, Catalina Vasquez, and Robert Bobrowski. We all have different roles. We all wear different hats. None of us sleep. Over the next, from 2017 until 2023, we took this idea of a test and we paid way more. We built this test into something that was real. We have now built the ClarityDX Prostate, which is 3 to 4 times more accurate than PSA. We have validated it using real world evidence, meaning this wasn't done just in the lab. We actually went out and we We got blood from men. We got the real numbers from men across the world. Our test can help prioritize and reduce the wait times for biopsy and MRI, which is a reality in Canada and different realities across the country. More importantly, as part of a public healthcare system, we can reduce the costs to that system because we can triage who needs to go for biopsy sooner than later. But more important than that, to the patients, we can give, the individual that needs to get treatment first, we can put that person there. That also, in certain provinces, there are men that get an elevated PSA, and they may have to wait 6 months to a year to actually see a urologist, and that's far too long to have that idea that I might have cancer weighing on my mind. Our test comes in and you get it back within a week. Typically, we try to do it, depending on where you are, within a day or 2 days. So we can help the individual. The reference is there. If anyone wants to see our data, just ask. I will provide the data and I can walk you through the paper as needed. Right now, that test is available to patients in Alberta and through Life Labs in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, and if you're in Quebec, through CDL laboratories. So what did the data look like? Just to sort of back up what I'm saying. We developed this test and validated it in a study that included almost 3,500 men. Right now, we're waiting for a couple of more sites to come on board so we can actually take this to the FDA and to Health Canada. We had multiple sites in Alberta, sites in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, and UCLA in Los Angeles, and also in the former Czech Republic in Prague. We had a university there that provided a separate site. And this is critical because when you submit data to Health Canada or the FDA, you have to have individual sites where you can say, I built this test here and I developed it using data and samples from these 2 sites, but now I'm going to test this result in 2 or 3 independent sites. And that's critical. You need to have sort of an independent analysis. So what is this test? Like government, healthcare moves slowly. If I wanted to be, a pure entrepreneur, I would go and say, I'm going to make something completely disruptive and shake up the healthcare system. But the healthcare system doesn't like that. You want something that's actually going to fit into the standard of care, because physicians don't like change. They want something that's going to be better, but they also want to build on the knowledge and what they're comfortable with. So what we've done, we take the same tube of blood that you would normally get for your total PSA analysis, and we measure total and free PSA. We also ask you some questions. How old are you? If you've had a previous negative biopsy, if you've had a digital rectal exam, and if that was normal or abnormal, and if you've had an MRI, tell us your prostate volume and the PIRADS, and we get that from your physician. And essentially, we push that through a machine learning algorithm. And I know that's in the news a lot today, but really what it comes down to is we take all of this data and we build a very strong predictive statistic. And it can tell us your risk of actually getting a grade group 2 or above prostate cancer diagnosis at biopsy. That's what it tells you. It's a risk score. And this is basically what the data looks like. And I know this is a very busy slide, so I'm going to take a moment or two just to walk through it. If you look at the graph over here on the left, if you look at the vertical axis, this is basically our ability to detect cancer. On the bottom axis along the bottom is essentially our ability to detect those men who are healthy, okay? Because you want to have a balance there. And if your curve can go towards the upper left, it's a better and better test. So you want to move to the top left corner. Now, if we look down here, the black line that kind of goes up through the middle, that's what PSA gives you. That's total PSA. It's a little bit better than a coin toss at segregating men who have cancer versus the men who don't. With our algorithm in the purple, our very, very simple one, because remember, I told you that we can add in different things. And this is something that patients told us. More men today don't want to go for a digital rectal exam. In conjunction with that, more and more family physicians don't feel comfortable actually providing a digital rectal exam. So we were asked, what is the benefit of your test with and without a digital rectal exam? So we're able to provide that. And that's the comparison of purple and blue. And this first column here is essentially our overall accuracy. And that's something that we have to provide to everyone to say, how good are we at, detecting cancer versus healthy all together. So PSA is, like I said, a little bit better than a coin toss. The fundamental version of ClarityDX Prostate, which basically gives you total and free PSA analysis. If you've had, how old are you? And if you've had a previous negative biopsy. That gives you about an 80% accuracy score. If you add in a DRE result, we bumped it up to about 82%. Now, if we add in MRI and DRE, we can bump that up even higher to 87%. Those numbers are as good as, if not better, than any other adjunctive screening test on the market today, including MRI. The really important part about this is this middle column right here. PSA can basically save about 12% of unnecessary biopsies. As you move up and add in more and more data with our tests, you bump it up from 32 up to 47%. So we can save 47% of unnecessary biopsies. That's really, really important in today's healthcare system and for any man making this decision. So remember I talked about not wanting to have too much of a disruptive technology or test. So this is the basically standard of care that is applied across Canada today. Now I'm in my early 50s and I've already started doing my PSA testing. So you're going to get a PSA test when you go to a family physician. Oh, computer is being slow. If my PSA comes back at less than 1, typically my physician is going to say, come back in about 4 years and we'll test you again. You're doing okay, don't worry about it. If my PSA is between 1 and 3, they're going to say, you know what? This might be your normal. Come back in 2 years and we'll check it again. If, however, your PSA is more than 3, most family physicians are going to say, you know what? Okay, perhaps we should really consider a DRE, but we're going to get a second PSA test done very, very quickly. And that's where the ClarityDX Prostate comes in. That should be the second test. It's an adjunctive strategy, and we're going to provide you and the physician with much more information than just your total PSA. If our test or an MRI comes back as abnormal, that's when you can actually go and have a very much more informed decision-making conversation with your physician. And this is taken, completely from the 2022 Canadian Urological Association Screening and Early Diagnosis Standard of Care. And again, just to push the fact, we can avoid 32 to 47% of unnecessary biopsies, but more importantly, we can prioritize those men that need to get the treatment sooner than later. So what does our report look like? So essentially what you're seeing here are the 4 different tests. You have just the fundamental ClarityDX Prostate here in number 1. 2, we've added in a DRE. 3, we've added in MRI, and 4, it's the MRI plus the DRE. We talked with the different urologists here in Alberta, and they basically said, we want this report to look like a consult. So they're going to get on this report everything that they would need to read about you as a patient. I'm just showing the result of the ClarityDX Prostate here, but they're going to get your name, your age, if you've had a DRE, that result, all of the things that you would want, including the total PSA and the free PSA, but also the ClarityDX Prostate the reference ranges, and whether or not that result is normal or abnormal. And like I said, it's essentially a risk score, and we give you the probability of having an abnormal prostate biopsy, which is going to be a grade group 2 or above. And if you're a little bit more gray haired like myself, it'll be a 4+3, Gleason grade 4+3 or higher. If you're in the blue region, you're a low risk. And now you can actually go back, you and your physician can make the decision whether or not to actually come back in a year or 6 months and take another test. So who can access this test today? Like I mentioned, patients across Canada at any APL, so Alberta Precision Lab collection sites in Alberta, Life Labs in British Columbia, Saskatchewan and Ontario, and CDL Labs in Quebec. The prostate test right now, ClarityDX Prostate, is unfortunately a private pay because we wanted to actually bring this test and make it available to as many men across Canada as possible before we had Health Canada approval. We are approved to do this in Alberta, and it is what we call a lab-developed test. It costs $300. That covers the analysis and basically getting the test done. If it's coming from out of province, there are some shipping and handling charges that have to go with it because the samples are coming frozen. It may be eligible for reimbursement through your employer's health spending account. Right now, I'm very happy to say that we have been working very diligently with the Alberta Health and other jurisdictional health coverage programs to have this test covered. This week, we actually started a utility study to start showing that physicians will use this test and they will use the information gained from this test to make decisions. Like yourselves at the Thunder Bay Survivors Group, we have a program so that if there is a man that can't cover the costs of this test, the survivor groups here in the province have worked together to actually say, we'll help those guys that need those additional funding. So some simple takeaways. So prostate cancer screening can actually reduce the number of deaths from prostate cancer. The data is there, it's international, you cannot discount that. But if we take a sort of a laid back approach to it, when done poorly, this screening can result in over-treatment, way too many biopsies, way too many secondary conditions like infection and incontinence due to this excessive use of biopsies. But when we use adjunctive testing strategies like the ClarityDX Prostate or an MRI, we can actually stratify those men who need to get to treatment faster, making sure that they have access to more treatments when they need them. I'll finish there. If anyone in the audience knows anybody that's at this point where they have an elevated PSA and they want to get more information before they make a decision, here's a QR code. It has my contact information. I'm more than happy to talk with anyone to provide this. On our website, we link like you guys do, and I was very happy to hear the way that you guys talked about and introduced yourselves in the audience tonight. We link or provide access to all of the survivor groups across Canada. That's critical. So if you guys don't think you're making a difference, I can tell you that I've talked to so many men across the country. Having these groups and having the ability to talk to men who are in their early stages of diagnosis, you make a difference. And for that, I really, really thank you. If anyone has any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer them.
Good question. Yes. Paul. Yeah, Paul.